The thunderclap of hooves against hard, packed earth echoed through the forest as Jane Williams scrambled up the steep incline, her heart hammering against her ribs like a frightened bird trying to escape its cage. 5 men on horseback were gaining ground, their silhouettes black against the dying light of the Texas sun. Jane's once pristine blue calico dress was now torn and mudded, her blonde hair falling in wild tangles around her shoulders as she fled deeper into the pine forest that bordered El Paso's northern edge. It was 1875, and Jane had never imagined she'd find herself running for her life from Harold Blackmore's men. The powerful rancher owned half the county and had decided he wanted to own her too. When she'd refused his proposal, he'd changed tactics, claiming she'd stolen from him. A convenient lie that gave him every right to hunt her down like an animal. "She went this way," a gruff voice called out, much closer than Jane had anticipated. "The tracks lead east toward the creek." Jane froze, confusion washing over her. She hadn't gone east, she was heading north, hoping to reach the railway station in the next county. Heart pounding, she pressed herself against the rough bark of a ponderosa pine, trying to make herself invisible as the horsemen thundered past, following what appeared to be fresh tracks heading in the opposite direction. As the sound of the pursuit faded, Jane allowed herself a small breath of relief. Someone had deliberately led Blackmore's men astray. But who would risk themselves for her sake? "They'll figure out they're following false tracks soon enough," came a low whisper from behind her. Jane whirled around, a scream building in her throat, only to have a warm, calloused hand cover her mouth. "SHH," the stranger cautioned, slowly removing his hand when she nodded her understanding. "Name's Griffin Faraday. I work at the Double R Ranch next to Blackmore's spread. Been watching his men hunt you since sundown." Jane studied the man before her. He stood tall, maybe 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders under a worn leather vest and blue cotton shirt. His face was sun-darkened and weathered, but his eyes were kind of deep green that reminded her of the forest around them. A dusty brown Stetson sat low on his brow, and a day's growth of beard shadowed his strong jaw. You laid false tracks," Jane whispered, her voice trembling. Griffin nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Did it while they were busy searching that clearing back yonder. Took my horse east, then doubled back on foot." He glanced in the direction the men had gone. "Won't fool them for long. We need to move." "Why are you helping me?" Jane asked, suspicion creeping into her voice. In her experience, men didn't offer help without expecting something in return. Griffin's expression grew serious. "Because Harold Blackmore is a snake who thinks he owns everything and everyone in this county, and I've never much cared for bullies." He offered his hand. "Now, are you coming with me, Miss Williams?" "Jane Williams," she replied, hesitantly placing her hand in his. "And yes, I'll come. It seems I don't have much choice." Griffin led her deeper into the forest, moving with the sure-footed confidence of someone who knew the land intimately. They traveled in silence for nearly half an hour before he whistled softly. A chestnut gelding emerged from behind a cluster of rocks, tethered loosely to a scrub oak. "This is Buck," Griffin said, patting the horse's neck. "He'll carry us both a ways, but we'll need to find you your own mount soon enough." Jane approached the horse cautiously. "I can ride, but where are we going?" Griffin's expression was unreadable in the deepening twilight. "I've got a cabin about 10 miles north of here. Blackmore and his men don't know about it. We'll be safe there until we figure out what to do next." Jane questioned, one eyebrow raised. "You got someplace else to be," Griffin challenged, his tone gentle despite the bluntness of his words. Jane sighed, shaking her head. She'd come to El Paso 3 months ago to work as a seamstress after her parents died of fever back east. She had no family, no close friends, and now, apparently, no job to return to. "No," she admitted. "I've got nowhere." Griffin nodded, as if her answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. "Then I reckon we're in this together, at least for now." He helped her mount the horse before swinging up behind her. The warmth of his chest against her back was oddly comforting as they set off through the darkening forest. Jane fought against the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm her. She'd been running most of the day, ever since the sheriff, clearly in Blackmore's pocket, had come to arrest her at Mrs. Peterson's boarding house. "You can rest," Griffin murmured close to her ear, his breath warm against her skin. "I won't let you fall." Despite her best intentions to stay alert, Jane found herself drifting, lulled by the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them and the solid presence of the man behind her. Her last conscious thought was that she was putting her life in the hands of a complete stranger, and somehow it felt right. When Jane awoke, the forest had given way to rockier terrain. The moon hung high overhead, casting silver light across the landscape. They were ascending a gentle slope toward what appeared to be a small cabin nestled against the side of a hill. "Where are we?" she asked groggily, straightening in the saddle. "Home," Griffin replied simply. "Or what passes for it." The cabin was modest but sturdy, built of thick pine logs with a stone chimney rising from one side. A small corral stood empty beside it, and a creek bubbled nearby, its water glinting in the moonlight. Griffin dismounted first, then reached up to help Jane down. Her legs buckled beneath her, stiff from the long ride and her earlier exertions. "Whoa there," Griffin said, catching her against him. "Take it easy." Jane's cheeks flushed with embarrassment as she steadied herself. "Thank you, I'm fine now." Griffin nodded, though he looked skeptical. "Let me tend to Buck, then we'll get you settled inside." Jane watched as he led the horse to the creek for water, then removed the saddle and bridle with practiced efficiency. When he returned to her side, he was carrying a rifle she hadn't noticed before, along with his saddlebags. "You think they'll find us here?" she asked, eyeing the weapon. Griffin shook his head. "Not likely. Few people know about this place. It belonged to my uncle before he passed. Been fixing it up when I get time away from the ranch." He pushed open the cabin door and motioned for her to enter. "It ain't much, but it's dry and warm once the fire's going." The interior was simple but neat. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a wooden table and 2 chairs nearby. A narrow bed stood in one corner, and shelves lined the walls, holding supplies and a few books. It was sparse, but Jane could see the care that had gone into making it a home. Griffin busied himself lighting a fire and several oil lamps while Jane hovered awkwardly near the door. "You can take the bed," he said, not looking up from his task. "I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly." "You can and you will," Griffin interrupted firmly. "You've had a harder day than most, I reckon." Jane wanted to argue, but exhaustion was settling deep into her bones. "Thank you," she said instead. Once the fire was crackling merrily, Griffin rummaged in his saddlebags and produced some jerky, biscuits, and a tin of coffee. "It ain't much of a supper, but it'll do until morning." Jane accepted the food gratefully, suddenly aware of how hungry she was. They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes before she spoke again. "Mr. Faraday, Griffin," he corrected. "Griffin," Jane amended. "I need to know what I've gotten you into." "Harold Blackmore isn't the kind of man who forgets a slight." Griffin's jaw tightened. "I'm well aware of what kind of man Blackmore is." "Then you know he won't stop looking for me." "And now he'll be looking for you too, once his men realize someone helped me." Griffin took a sip of his coffee, his expression thoughtful. "Been meaning to move on from these parts anyway. Blackmore's been squeezing out the smaller ranches for years. The Double R is one of the last holdouts, but it's only a matter of time." Jane studied him across the table. "You're willing to leave your life behind for a woman you just met?" A slow smile spread across Griffin's face, transforming his serious expression. "When you put it that way, it does sound a bit foolish, but I believe in doing what's right, Miss Williams, and helping you was right." "Jane," she said softly. "If I'm calling you Griffin, you should call me Jane." Griffin nodded, that smile still playing at his lips. "Jane it is." There was something in the way he said her name that sent a flutter through her chest, something she hadn't felt in a long time if ever. "We should get some rest," Griffin said, rising from the table. "Tomorrow will come early and we've got decisions to make." Jane wanted to ask more questions, to understand this man who had risked everything to help her, but her body was demanding sleep. She allowed Griffin to show her to the bed, which he had quickly made up with fresh linens. "I'll be right over there if you need anything," he said, gesturing to a bedroll he'd laid out near the hearth. Jane nodded, suddenly shy. "Good night, Griffin, and thank you for everything." "Good night, Jane," he replied, his voice a low rumble that seemed to wrap around her like a warm blanket. "Sleep well." Despite her exhaustion, Jane lay awake for a time, listening to Griffin's quiet movements as he checked the cabin's windows and door, ensuring they were secure. There was something profoundly comforting about his presence, a steadiness that made her feel safer than she had in months. As sleep finally claimed her, Jane wondered what the morning would bring, and whether she'd find the courage to tell Griffin the whole truth about why Harold Blackmore wanted her so badly. Dawn broke clear and cold, sunlight streaming through the cabin's small windows. Jane awoke disoriented, momentarily forgetting where she was until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She sat up, finding herself alone in the cabin. A note sat on the table beside a plate of what appeared to be freshly cooked eggs and bacon. "Gone hunting. Back by noon. Stay inside." Jane's stomach growled at the sight of the food. She rose, running her fingers through her tangled hair in a futile attempt to make herself presentable before sitting down to eat. The food was simple but delicious, still warm from the skillet. After eating, Jane explored the cabin more thoroughly. Griffin's few possessions were neatly organized: clothes folded in a trunk, tools hanging on pegs, books stacked on a shelf. One volume caught her eye, a collection of Shakespeare's sonnets, well-worn and obviously much read. She wouldn't have pegged the rugged cowboy as a poetry lover. A small mirror hanging near the door revealed her disheveled appearance. Her once neat hair was a mass of tangles, her face smudged with dirt, and her dress torn in several places. Jane sighed, wishing for a bath and clean clothes. She found a bucket near the door and decided to fetch water from the creek. Stepping outside, Jane was struck by the beauty of Griffin's hideaway. The cabin sat in a small clearing surrounded by pines, with mountains rising in the distance. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and sage. It was peaceful in a way El Paso had never been. Jane had just filled the bucket when the sound of approaching hooves made her freeze. Relief flooded through her when she recognized Griffin's chestnut gelding, with Griffin himself in the saddle. He wasn't alone, though he led a second horse, a pretty dappled mare, and had what looked like a deer carcass draped across its back. Griffin dismounted when he saw her, his expression concerned. "I told you to stay inside." "I needed water," Jane explained, lifting the bucket slightly. "And I couldn't stay cooped up any longer." Griffin's expression softened. "Fair enough, I brought you something." He gestured to a bundle tied behind his saddle. Jane set down the bucket and approached as Griffin untied the package. Inside was a simple dress, petticoat and shawl, along with a hairbrush and a bar of soap. "Where did you get these?" Jane asked, running her fingers over the clean fabric in amazement. There's a small trading post about 5 miles east of here. Owner's an old friend, won't mention to anyone that I was there." Griffin nodded toward the second horse. "Bought you a horse too. Her name's Penny. Figured you'd need your own mount if." He trailed off, leaving the implication hanging: if they needed to run, if they couldn't stay here, if Blackmore's men found them. "Thank you," Jane said, clutching the bundle to her chest. "You've been kinder than I deserve." Griffin's gaze was steady. "You don't strike me as the kind of woman who steals, Jane Williams. So why don't you tell me why Blackmore really wants you?" Jane swallowed hard, knowing the moment had come for truth. "Could I? Would it be possible to clean up first? I'd feel better facing this conversation, feeling more human." Griffin nodded. "Creek's cold but clean. I'll give you privacy. Just don't go too far downstream. There's a bend that's visible from the valley." Jane thanked him and headed to the creek, bundle in hand. The water was indeed cold, but the sensation of washing away the dirt and fear of the previous day was worth the discomfort. The dress Griffin had brought was simple, a brown calico with small white flowers, but it was clean and fit reasonably well. The act of brushing her hair and arranging it in a simple braid made Jane feel more like herself again. When she returned to the cabin, Griffin had skinned the deer and was cutting the meat into portions. He looked up as she approached, and something in his expression made her heart skip a beat. "You clean up nice," he said, his voice slightly rough. Jane felt her cheeks warm. "Thank you, for the dress and everything else." Griffin nodded, returning to his task. "I'll be done with this soon, then we can talk." Jane busied herself fetching more water and tidying the cabin while Griffin finished with the deer meat. When he came inside, he'd washed up as well, his sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing strong forearms tanned by the sun. They sat at the table, a pot of coffee between them. Jane wrapped her hands around her mug, drawing comfort from its warmth as she gathered her thoughts. "I came to El Paso 3 months ago," she began. "My parents died of fever in Philadelphia, and I had nothing left there. I'd trained as a seamstress under my mother, so when I saw an advertisement for work in Mrs. Peterson's dress shop, it seemed like Providence." Griffin listened silently, his green eyes intent on her face. "I met Harold Blackmore my second week in town. He came to order a suit for some social function. He was attentive." Jane's hands tightened around her mug. "At first I was flattered. He's wealthy, respected, or feared at least. He began coming to the shop regularly, bringing gifts, inviting me to dine with him." "And you accepted?" Griffin asked, no judgment in his tone. Jane shook her head. "Not at first, but Mrs. Peterson encouraged it, said I'd be a fool to turn down the attentions of the richest rancher in the county." She took a deep breath. "So I went to dinner with him. Once, just once." Griffin waited patiently as Jane gathered herself. "He proposed that night. Said he needed a wife, and I was pretty enough and young enough to suit. When I asked for time to consider, he changed. Told me I didn't understand, that it wasn't a request but a statement of fact. That I would be his wife." Jane could still remember the cold calculation in Blackmore's eyes, the way his hand had gripped her wrist too tightly when she tried to leave. "I refused him outright then. Told him I had no interest in marrying a man I barely knew, regardless of his wealth. He laughed at me." Jane's voice hardened at the memory. "Said I'd come around once I realized there were no other options for me in El Paso." Griffin's jaw tightened. "Sounds like Blackmore. He began spreading rumors that I was improper, that I'd led him on, made promises. Business at the shop dwindled. Mrs. Peterson kept me on, but I could tell she was worried about her reputation." Jane sighed. "Then, yesterday morning, the sheriff came to the boarding house with a warrant for my arrest. Blackmore had accused me of stealing a valuable watch from his home." "But you never went to his home," Griffin said, making it a statement rather than a question. "Never. Jane confirmed. It was a lie, a convenient excuse to have me arrested. I have no doubt that once I was in jail at his mercy, he would have offered me a choice marriage or prison. So you ran, Griffin concluded. Jane nodded. I slipped out the back of the boarding house while Mrs. Peterson was talking to the sheriff. I thought if I could reach the railway, I could get to Santa Fe, maybe find work there. She met Griffin's gaze directly. I'm not a thief, Griffin. I've never stolen anything in my life. I believe you, he said simply. Those 3 words nearly undid her. After months of suspicion and judgment, to be believed so readily was overwhelming. Jane blinked rapidly against the threat of tears. Thank you, she whispered. Griffin reached across the table, his hand covering hers. Blackmore's been running roughshod over this county for years, using his money and influence to get whatever he wants. Land, cattle, people, not many stand against him. Why do you? Jane asked. Something dark flashed in Griffin's eyes. Let's just say we have history. Jane sensed there was more to the story, much more, but Griffin's expression made it clear he wasn't ready to share it. What do we do now? She asked instead. Griffin withdrew his hand, leaving Jane's feeling oddly cold. We have options. You could still try for Santa Fe. I've got money saved enough to see you settled somewhere new. And you? Jane pressed. Griffin shrugged. I've been thinking of heading further west anyway. California, maybe, or up to Montana. Jane studied him, this man who had risked everything for a stranger, who was willing to give her the means to start a new life, expecting nothing in return, who was ready to uproot his own life because he'd helped her. Why did you really help me, Griffin? She asked softly. The truth. Griffin was silent for a long moment, his gaze moving to the window, to the mountains beyond. I was in town yesterday, picking up supplies. Heard the sheriff talking about arresting you, heard Blackmore's men laughing about how their boss would tame the stubborn seamstress once he had you locked up. His eyes returned to hers, intense and sincere. Something in me couldn't let that happen. I followed them when they started tracking you, watched you run into those woods, and I just knew I had to help. Jane felt something shift between them, a connection that hadn't been there before, or perhaps had been there all along but was only now becoming clear. I'm glad you did, she said quietly. The moment stretched between them, full of unspoken possibilities. Then Griffin stood abruptly. I should check on the horses, make sure they're settled for the night. Jane nodded, feeling both disappointed and relieved at the broken tension. And I should see about making us some dinner with that deer meat. Griffin paused at the door. Jane. Yes. Whatever you decide to do next, you're not alone anymore. Remember that. Before she could respond, he was gone, leaving her with a strange warmth blooming in her chest, and a decision that suddenly seemed much more complicated than it had just moments before. The next few days fell into an unexpected rhythm. Griffin showed Jane the boundaries of his property, always careful to keep their movements concealed from the valley below. They worked together, Griffin hunting and maintaining the cabin, Jane cooking and helping to preserve the deer meat for the winter ahead. In the evenings, they talked by the fire, sharing stories of their lives before El Paso. Jane learned that Griffin had been raised on a small ranch in Colorado, had fought briefly in the war between the states, despite being barely 18, and had drifted southwest afterward, unable to return to a home that held too many painful memories. He spoke little of his family, though Jane gathered they were no longer living. For her part, Jane told Griffin about growing up in Philadelphia, the daughter of a seamstress mother and bookkeeper father. She shared stories of the bustling city, of learning her mother's trade from the time she could hold a needle, of her dreams of someday having her own dress shop. What neither of them discussed was the future, what would happen when it was safe for Jane to leave, or whether she wanted to leave at all. The unspoken question hung between them, growing more insistent with each passing day. On the fourth morning, Griffin announced he needed to go back to the Double R Ranch. "Need to collect my wages and give notice," he explained. "Can't just disappear without a word, might raise suspicions." Jane felt a stab of panic at the thought of being left alone. "Is it safe for you to go back?" "What if Blackmore's men recognize you?" Griffin's smile was reassuring. "They never got a good look at me in the forest, and I've worked alongside most of them at cattle drives and roundups. Unless someone saw me laying those false tracks, there's no reason for them to suspect me." Still, Jane worried. "When will you return?" "Tomorrow by nightfall," Griffin promised. "Keep the rifle close and stay out of sight. There's plenty of food, and if anything happens—" He hesitated. "If I'm not back by noon the day after tomorrow, take Penny and head north. There's a map in my trunk showing the way to Santa Fe." Jane felt cold at the thought. "I'm sure that won't be necessary." Griffin nodded, though his expression remained serious. "Just in case." He left shortly after, riding Buck down a hidden trail that would bring him to the main road well away from the cabin. Jane watched until he disappeared among the trees, then returned inside, already feeling the absence of his steady presence. The day stretched endlessly. Jane busied herself with mending her old dress, then tackled some of Griffin's clothes that needed repair. She read from his small collection of books, prepared food, and watched the sun track across the sky. As darkness fell, the cabin seemed larger and emptier than before, the silence oppressive. Jane slept poorly that night, startling awake at every sound from the forest. By morning, she was exhausted and on edge. She forced herself to eat, then took Penny for a short ride around the clearing, always keeping the cabin in sight. The activity helped calm her nerves, and she found herself developing a genuine affection for the gentle mare. As the afternoon waned with no sign of Griffin, Jane's anxiety returned. She paced the cabin, watching the trail for any movement, jumping at shadows. When the sun began to set, she lit the lamps and built up the fire, determined to keep vigil until Griffin returned. It was past midnight when Jane heard the distinct sound of hooves approaching. She grabbed the rifle, her heart pounding, and moved to the window. Relief flooded through her as she recognized Buck's chestnut coat in the moonlight, with Griffin slumped in the saddle. Jane rushed outside, rifle still in hand, just as Griffin dismounted. Even in the dim light, she could see something was wrong. He moved stiffly, favoring his left side. "Griffin!" She called softly, hurrying to his side. He turned and Jane gasped. His face was bruised, a cut above his right eye crusted with dried blood. "Made it back," he said, his voice rough. "What happened?" Jane demanded, slipping under his arm to support him as they moved toward the cabin. Griffin grunted in pain. "Had a disagreement with some of Blackmore's men. Nothing to worry about." Once inside, Jane helped Griffin to a chair and quickly fetched water and clean cloths. As she cleaned his wounds, the full extent of his injuries became clear: bruised ribs, a split lip, and knuckles raw from fighting. "This is more than a disagreement," Jane said tightly, pressing a cool cloth to his swollen eye. "Tell me what really happened." Griffin sighed, wincing as the movement jarred his ribs. "Collected my wages from the foreman, no problem. Was heading out when 3 of Blackmore's men cornered me in the stable. Said they'd been asking around town about who might have helped you escape." Jane's stomach knotted with guilt. "They knew it was you." Griffin shook his head, then immediately regretted it. "No, but they'd heard I was sweet on you." "Sweet on me," Jane repeated, startled. "But we barely knew each other in town." A hint of a smile touched Griffin's battered face. "Might have watched you sometimes. At church, in town, never worked up the courage to speak to you proper." The revelation stunned Jane. She'd never noticed Griffin in El Paso, never realized he'd been aware of her before their meeting in the forest. "Anyway," Griffin continued, "they thought I might know where you'd gone. I told them I hadn't seen you, didn't know anything. They didn't believe me. So they beat you," Jane concluded, anger rising in her chest. "I gave as good as I got," Griffin assured her, flexing his bruised knuckles. "Left two of them nursing broken noses. The third ran to fetch reinforcements, which was my cue to leave." "Did they follow you?" Jane asked, suddenly fearful. "No, made sure of that. Took the long way around, doubled back several times. Nobody knows about this place, Jane. We're safe." Jane wasn't so certain, but she didn't argue. Instead, she focused on tending his wounds, wrapping his ribs tightly and applying salve to his cuts. Her fingers trembled slightly as they traced the lines of his face, cleaning away the blood and dirt. Griffin caught her hand as she worked, his green eyes serious despite the swelling. "I'm fine, Jane, really." "You're not fine," she countered. "You're hurt because of me, because you helped me." "I'm hurt because Harold Blackmore is a bully who thinks he owns people," Griffin corrected. "Don't take that on yourself." Jane shook her head, tears threatening. "If I hadn't run, if I had just, married him, let him control you," Griffin's voice was suddenly fierce. "You did the right thing, Jane, and I'd help you again, even knowing this would happen." The intensity in his eyes stole Jane's breath. No one had ever looked at her that way before, as if she were something precious, something worth protecting at any cost. "Why?" she whispered. Griffin's hand moved from hers to cup her cheek gently. "Because in the 4 days you've been here, I've come to care for you more than I thought possible. Because you're brave and kind and stronger than you know. Because the thought of Blackmore laying claim to you makes me want to burn his whole ranch to the ground." Jane's heart thundered in her chest. She leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "I've come to care for you too," she admitted softly. "More than I should, given the circumstances." Something fierce and tender passed between them, and Jane found herself leaning closer, drawn to him despite the danger, despite the uncertainty of their situation. Griffin hesitated, his eyes searching hers for permission. Jane closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his in a gentle kiss. Griffin responded with a restrained passion that spoke of his injuries and his respect for her. When they parted, both were breathing unsteadily. "We should talk about what happens next," Griffin said, his voice rough with emotion. Jane nodded, though she made no move to pull away from him. "Yes, we should." Neither of them spoke for a long moment, content to remain close, foreheads touching, sharing the same breath. Then Griffin straightened with a wince, his injuries reasserting themselves. "Blackmore won't stop looking for you," he said finally, "and now he has reason to look for me too." "We could leave," Jane suggested. "Together. You mentioned California or Montana." Hope flickered in Griffin's eyes. "You'd come with me. Start over somewhere new." Jane realized with sudden clarity that she would follow this man anywhere. In less than a week, he had become more important to her than anything else in her life. "Yes," she said simply. "I would." Griffin's smile was worth every bit of uncertainty she felt. "Then that's what we'll do. We'll leave as soon as I'm healed enough to travel. Head west, find a place where Blackmore's reach doesn't extend." The plan was reckless, perhaps even foolish. They barely knew each other, were risking everything on a connection forged in danger and isolation. Yet Jane couldn't bring herself to care about practicalities, not when Griffin was looking at her as if she were the sunrise after the longest night. "It won't be easy," she warned, ever practical despite her racing heart. Griffin laughed, then groaned as the movement pulled at his ribs. "Nothing worth having ever is." Jane helped him to the bed, insisting he take it while she slept by the fire. Though Griffin protested, his exhaustion and injuries won out. He was asleep almost as soon as his head touched the pillow, his breathing deep and even. Jane watched him for a time, marveling at how completely her life had changed in less than a week. She had gone from a lonely seamstress to a woman on the run, and now to a woman with a future uncertain, though it was with a man who was quickly claiming her heart. As she settled onto the bedroll near the fire, Jane knew there would be challenges ahead. Blackmore wouldn't give up easily, and starting over in a new place would test them both. But for the first time since her parents' deaths, Jane felt a spark of genuine hope for the future. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. Morning brought a gentle rain that pattered against the cabin roof. Jane woke early, checking on Griffin before starting breakfast. He was still sleeping deeply, his battered face relaxed in repose. She left him to rest, knowing his body needed time to heal. Jane busied herself with preparations for their eventual departure. She took inventory of their supplies, made a list of items they would need for the journey, and studied Griffin's maps to familiarize herself with the possible routes west. The activity kept her mind from dwelling too much on the dangers they still faced. Griffin awoke around midday, moving stiffly but with more ease than the night before. He insisted on getting up, ignoring Jane's protests that he should rest longer. "Can't lie around all day," he said, making his way carefully to the table where Jane had laid out a simple lunch. "We've got plans to make." They spent the afternoon discussing their options. Griffin favored heading to California, where the boom of the gold rush had given way to more stable opportunities in ranching and farming. Jane was inclined to agree the climate would be milder than Montana, and the greater distance from Texas appealed to her. "We'll need supplies," Griffin noted, marking locations on his map, "trading posts in towns where we can restock along the way." "And money?" Jane asked hesitantly. "I have very little saved." Griffin's expression was reassuring. "I've been saving most of my wages for years." "Got a fair amount put by. Enough to see us to California and get us started there, if we're careful." The casual way he referred to their future together sent a warm flush through Jane. This was really happening. They were planning a life together, far from El Paso and Harold Blackmore. "When do we leave?" she asked. Griffin considered. "Another week, I think. Need to let these ribs heal a bit more before tackling a long journey." He looked up at her, his expression softening. "That is, if you're still sure about this." Jane reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "I'm sure, Griffin. More sure than I've been about anything in a long time." The relief in his eyes was palpable. "Good. That's good." Their quiet moment was shattered by the distant sound of multiple horses approaching from the valley below. Griffin was on his feet in an instant, pain forgotten as he moved to the window. "Riders," he confirmed grimly. "At least 5 of them coming up the main trail." Jane's blood ran cold. Blackmore's men, most likely. Griffin grabbed the rifle and checked that it was loaded. "They must have followed me after all, or found someone who knew about this place." Panic threatened to overwhelm Jane. "What do we do?" Griffin's expression was grim but determined. "You take Penny and ride north following the creek. It leads to a path that will take you over the ridge and down into the next valley. I marked it on the map." "And you?" Jane demanded, already knowing the answer. "I'll hold them off, buy you time to get away." "No." The word burst from Jane with surprising force. "I won't leave you here to face them alone." Griffin turned to her, his eyes fierce. "Jane, listen to me. You have to go. If Blackmore gets his hands on you, then he gets his hands on both of us," Jane interrupted. "Because I am not leaving you, Griffin Faraday. Not now, not ever." For a moment, Griffin looked as though he might argue further. Then his expression changed, softened. "You are the most stubborn woman I've ever met," he said, a hint of admiration in his voice. "Yes. "Well, you should have considered that before you fell in love with me," Jane replied without thinking. The words hung between them, neither having spoken of love until this moment. Griffin's eyes widened, then crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "I did consider it. It's one of the things I love most about you." Despite the danger approaching, Jane felt her heart soar. "You love me." Griffin reached out, touching her cheek gently. "From the moment I saw you running through that forest, I think." "Too soon to say it, maybe, but with those riders coming, I reckon now might be our only chance." Jane covered his hand with hers. "I love you too," she said simply, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. The sound of the approaching horses grew louder, jolting them back to reality. Griffin's expression hardened as he focused on their immediate survival. "There's another way out," he said suddenly. "A cave system behind the cabin. The entrance is hidden by brush, but it leads through the hillside and comes out near the ridge, if we can reach it without being seen." Hope flared in Jane's chest. "We can both escape." Griffin nodded. "Leave everything. Just take the rifles and whatever food you can stuff in your pockets. I'll get the horses ready." They moved with urgent purpose, Griffin slipping out the back door to prepare Buck and Penny while Jane gathered the essentials ammunition: a canteen of water, jerky, and the map. She was just reaching for Griffin's money pouch when the first shot rang out, splintering the cabin's front window. Jane dropped to the floor as more shots followed. Through the broken window, she could see riders approaching, spreading out to surround the cabin. Her heart in her throat, she crawled to the back door, praying Griffin had made it to cover. She found him crouched behind a rocky outcropping, the horses tethered nearby, hidden by a stand of pines. Relief flooded through her as she joined him. "They've got us surrounded," Griffin said grimly, "but they don't know about the cave, if we can make it there." Another volley of shots hit the cabin, followed by a man's voice. "Griffin Faraday, we know you're in there. Send out the Williams woman and maybe we'll let you live." Jane and Griffin exchanged glances. "That's Blackmore himself," Griffin whispered. "Must be important to him if he came personally." "Faraday," Blackmore's voice came again. "You've got 1 minute before we burn that cabin to the ground." Griffin gripped Jane's hand. "We need to move now while they're focused on the cabin. The cave entrance is just beyond those pines. Stay low and move fast when I say." Jane nodded, heart pounding. Griffin counted down silently, then whispered. Now they ran, crouched low toward the pine grove. They were halfway there when a shout went up from one of the riders. "There they are, behind the rocks." Gunfire erupted again, bullets kicking up dirt around them as they ran. Jane felt a stinging sensation across her upper arm but kept moving, focused solely on reaching the pines. Griffin fired back, providing covering fire as they reached the tree line. "The cave entrance is just ahead," Griffin panted, pulling Jane along. A narrow opening beneath that fallen log. Jane could see it now, a dark gap barely visible beneath a massive fallen pine. They scrambled toward it as more bullets whizzed past them. Griffin helped Jane into the opening first, then followed, dragging the horse's reins after him. The cave entrance was tight, but opened into a larger space beyond. They led the nervous animals deeper into the darkness, the sounds of pursuit growing more distant. "Are you hurt?" Griffin asked, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "Just a graze," Jane assured him, though her arm was burning fiercely now. "What about you?" "I'm fine." "Can you walk?" "The passage narrows ahead. We'll need to leave the horses and continue on foot." Jane nodded, then realized he couldn't see her in the darkness. "Yes, I can walk." They secured the horses as best they could, leaving them with water and feed, then proceeded deeper into the cave system. Griffin produced a small lantern from his saddlebag, its light casting eerie shadows on the rock walls. "I explored these caves when I first came here," he explained as they navigated the winding passage. "Found that they come out near a waterfall about 2 miles from here. Blackmore and his men won't know about this escape route." The journey through the caves was difficult. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes so narrow they had to squeeze through sideways. Jane's arm throbbed, blood soaking the sleeve of her dress, but she pressed on without complaint. The sounds of pursuit had faded entirely, replaced by the drip of water and their own labored breathing. After what seemed like hours, a faint light appeared ahead. The passage widened into a small chamber with an opening visible beyond. "We made it," Griffin said, relief evident in his voice. "That opening leads out near the ridge." Jane sagged against the cave wall, suddenly lightheaded. The adrenaline that had carried her through their escape was fading, leaving her weak and dizzy. Griffin was at her side instantly, concern etched on his face. "Let me see that arm." He gently rolled up her sleeve, revealing a deep gash where the bullet had grazed her. "This needs tending," he said grimly, "but we need to get farther from the cabin first." "Can you make it a little longer?" Jane nodded, gritting her teeth against the pain. "I'll be fine." Griffin looked unconvinced but didn't argue. He supported her as they made their way to the cave opening, pausing to check for any sign of Blackmore's men before helping her outside. The late afternoon sun was blinding after the darkness of the caves. They emerged onto a rocky ledge overlooking a steep valley, a waterfall thundering nearby. The landscape was wild and beautiful, untouched by human presence. "We'll follow the ridge for a few miles," Griffin said, pointing north. "There's a trapper's cabin I know of. We can rest there, tend to your wound." Jane nodded, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other as they began their journey along the ridge. The terrain was challenging, especially in her weakened state, but the fear of what lay behind them drove her forward. As they walked, Griffin kept a protective arm around her waist, taking as much of her weight as she would allow. Despite the danger, despite her injury and exhaustion, Jane found herself drawing strength from his presence. "I meant what I said back at the cabin," she said suddenly. "About loving you." Griffin's arm tightened around her. "I know, I meant it too. It's crazy, isn't it? We've known each other less than a week." Griffin was silent for a moment. "My pa used to say that some people take a lifetime to fall in love and some just need a moment. Said he knew my ma was the one first time he laid eyes on her." "And you? Did you know the first time you saw me?" Jane asked, curious despite their dire situation. A smile touched Griffin's lips. "First time I saw you was in church about 2 months back. You were wearing a blue dress, and you smiled at Mrs. Peterson's youngest when he offered you a wildflower. I remember thinking you had the kindest smile I'd ever seen." The revelation warmed Jane's heart. "I wish I'd noticed you then. You had plenty on your mind," Griffin said generously. "And I wasn't much to notice, just another cowhand in his Sunday best." "You're everything to notice," Jane countered softly. "Strong, kind, brave. The sort of man my father would have approved of." Griffin ducked his head, clearly unused to such praise. "Let's get to that cabin before dark," he said, changing the subject. "We've got a long journey ahead of us." They continued in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was setting by the time the trapper's cabin came into view, a small, crude structure built against a rocky outcropping for protection from the elements. "It's not much," Griffin warned as they approached. "Just a shelter, really, used during hunting season." Indeed, the cabin was little more than a one-room shack with a dirt floor and crude fireplace. But to Jane, it looked like a palace. She sank gratefully onto a rough wooden bench while Griffin set about making a fire. Once the flames were crackling, Griffin turned his attention to Jane's wound. He cleaned it carefully with water from a nearby stream, then bound it with strips torn from his own shirt. "It's not too deep," he assured her. "Should heal clean if we keep it covered." "What about Blackmore?" Jane asked, voicing the concern that had been nagging at her. "Will he keep searching?" Griffin's expression was grim. "For a while, yes, but he can't devote his men to hunting us forever. The important thing is to get far enough away that he can't find us easily." "California," Jane said, nodding. "It's still our best option. We'll need to get to a town first. Get proper supplies, maybe join a wagon train heading west." Griffin sat beside her, taking her hand in his. "It won't be an easy journey. Are you sure you're up for it?" Jane squeezed his hand. "I'm sure, especially if we're together." Griffin smiled, then leaned in to kiss her gently. Jane responded eagerly, despite her exhaustion and pain. When they parted, Griffin's eyes were warm with affection. "Get some rest," he urged. "I'll keep watch." Jane wanted to argue, to insist he needed rest as much as she did, but exhaustion was overwhelming her. She settled onto the rough pallet Griffin arranged by the fire and was asleep almost instantly. The next few days passed in a blur of travel and recovery. They moved cautiously northward, staying off main trails and avoiding settlements. Griffin hunted for their food, and they slept under the stars when no shelter was available. Jane's arm healed quickly, and Griffin's injuries from his earlier beating faded. They grew closer with each passing day, learning each other's habits and histories, building a foundation for the future they hoped to share. 2 weeks after their escape from the cabin, they reached a small trading post on the edge of New Mexico territory. It was far enough from El Paso that news of them would not have reached there, Griffin reasoned, and they needed supplies badly. The post was a collection of rough buildings surrounding a central store. A few travelers milled about trappers, traders, and a small group that appeared to be preparing for the journey west. "A wagon train," Griffin noted as they approached. "Heading to California by the looks of it. Good timing." They tied their horses outside the store and entered, conscious of their bedraggled appearance. The storekeeper, a grizzled man with a substantial beard, eyed them curiously. "Help you folks?" he asked, leaning on the counter. "Need supplies," Griffin replied. "Food, ammunition, clothes." "And information about that wagon train outside." The storekeeper nodded. "Marshall's train, heading for Sacramento, leaving tomorrow at first light. Looking to join." Griffin glanced at Jane, who nodded slightly. "We might be. Who do we talk to?" "Ezra Marshall. Big fella with the red beard. He's always looking for good hands for the journey, especially if you've got your own horses." While Griffin continued gathering information, Jane wandered the store, selecting necessities for their journey. She found herself drawn to a display of simple rings, nothing fancy, just bands of silver and gold. Griffin joined her, following her gaze to the display. "See something you like?" he asked softly. Jane blushed. "Just looking." Griffin studied her face, then reached past her to pick up a simple gold band. "This one would fit you, I think." Jane's heart skipped a beat. "Griffin." "I know it's fast," he said quietly. "Too fast, maybe, but I love you, Jane Williams, and I want to build a life with you in California." "A proper life." Tears pricked at Jane's eyes. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Griffin's smile was tender. "I am. It won't be easy starting over in a new place, but I can't imagine doing it without you as my wife." Jane's answer was immediate and certain. "Yes, 1,000 times yes." Griffin's face lit up with joy. He turned to the storekeeper, who had been watching their exchange with poorly disguised interest. "We'll take this ring too," the storekeeper grinned. "Got a preacher passing through, staying at the boarding house. He could marry you before the train leaves tomorrow, if you've a mind." Griffin looked to Jane, leaving the decision to her. She nodded, smiling through her tears. Tomorrow would be perfect. They spent the remainder of the day preparing for both their wedding and the journey ahead. Griffin spoke with Ezra Marshall, securing their place with the wagon train in exchange for Griffin's skills as a hunter and scout. Jane purchased fabric for a new dress, determined not to be married in her travel-worn clothing. That evening they took rooms at the small boarding house, separate rooms, as propriety demanded for one more night. As Griffin bid her good night at her door, he kissed her with a tenderness that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. "Until tomorrow, almost Mrs. Faraday," he whispered. Jane's heart swelled with happiness. Until tomorrow. The wedding was simple but beautiful. Jane wore a new blue dress she had stayed up late finishing, with wildflowers in her hair. Griffin had purchased a new shirt and had even managed to shave for the occasion. The preacher, a kindly older man, performed the ceremony in the boarding house parlor, with the storekeeper and his wife as witnesses. As they exchanged vows and rings, Griffin had surprised her by purchasing a matching band for himself. Jane felt a sense of rightness that transcended the unusual circumstances of their meeting and courtship. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, and Griffin kissed her with gentle passion, she knew she had found her home. The wagon train departed as scheduled, a procession of 20 wagons heading west toward California and a new beginning. Jane and Griffin rode alongside, occasionally helping with hunting or scouting, but mostly keeping to themselves. Their status as newlyweds afforded them a certain privacy that both treasured. At night, they would make their camp a little apart from the others, sharing whispered conversations and tender embraces beneath the vast canopy of stars. They spoke of their hopes for California, a small ranch perhaps, or a dress shop for Jane in one of the growing towns. Griffin talked of raising horses, and Jane shared her dreams of someday having children to fill their home with laughter. The journey was long and often difficult. They faced harsh weather, difficult terrain, and occasional tensions among the travelers. But through it all, Jane and Griffin's bond only strengthened, their love deepening with each challenge overcome together. As they crossed into California nearly 3 months after leaving Texas, Jane reflected on the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. If she hadn't refused Harold Blackmore, if she hadn't fled into the forest that day, if Griffin hadn't been there to lay false tracks and lead her to safety, none of this would have happened. What had begun as the worst day of her life had led to the greatest happiness she had ever known. They settled eventually in a small but growing town in the Sacramento Valley. Griffin found work at a local ranch while saving to buy land of their own, and Jane opened a modest dress shop that quickly gained a reputation for quality work. They purchased a small house on the edge of town, with enough land for Griffin to keep horses, and for Jane to plant the garden she had always wanted. 2 years after their arrival in California, Jane gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas, after Griffin's father. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later. Their home rang with the laughter and energy of children, just as they had dreamed during those nights on the trail west. Harold Blackmore became a distant memory, a shadow that occasionally darkened their thoughts but held no real power over their lives. They heard, through occasional travelers from Texas, that Blackmore had eventually married the daughter of another wealthy rancher, a strategic alliance that expanded his holdings but, they suspected, brought him little joy. One evening, as they sat on the porch of their home watching their children play in the fading light, Griffin took Jane's hand, his thumb brushing over the gold band he had placed there 5 years earlier. "You ever regret it?" he asked quietly. Running from Blackmore, leaving everything behind, Jane leaned her head against his shoulder, watching as Thomas helped his little sister chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "How could I regret finding you building this life together?" Griffin pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "Sometimes I still can't believe how lucky I was, finding you running through that forest." "It wasn't luck," Jane said softly. "It was fate. We were meant to find each other, meant to be together." As the sun set over their little piece of California, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Jane Williams Faraday knew she had found what every person searches for: a love worth risking everything for, a partner to face life's challenges with, a home built not of wood and nails but of shared dreams and unwavering devotion. What had begun with fear and desperation, a woman fleeing through the forest, a cowboy leaving false tracks to save a stranger, had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. And as Griffin drew her closer, his arm warm and secure around her shoulders, Jane knew with absolute certainty that every step of their difficult journey had been worth it, leading them exactly where they were always meant to be together.